Welcome back to Reformed Thinking. It is Saturday, February 14, 2026, and if you were checking your calendar, you know that means the rest of the world is probably a bit preoccupied right now with, chocolates, red roses, dinner reservations.
All that stuff, yeah.
But we are doing something a little different. We are two Protestant Christians holding to the Westminster Confession, and we're taking a hard look at history through the lens of God's sovereignty. And today, we are going to look at a man whose heart was offered to God, promptly and sincerely, but who, well, probably wouldn't have been much fun on a Valentine's date.
That is a very safe assumption. He was not exactly known for his small talk or romantic gestures, at least not in the way we think of them.
Right.
We are talking about the theologian of the Holy Spirit, the architect of the Reformation in Geneva. We are talking about John Calvin.
Now, I have to be honest right out of the gate here. When you say the name John Calvin to, the average person on the street or even the average Christian in the pew, you get a very specific reaction. And it is usually not a warm and fuzzy feeling.
No, it is not. The caricature is. It's very strong.
They picture a guy in a black hat looking like he just sucked on a lemon. A joyless tyrant.
Yeah.
A man who invented a theology just to make people feel bad about themselves. Or they see him as this cold, unfeeling intellectual who ruled Geneva like some kind of dictator, punishing people for smiling.
Right.
He was born in 1509. I mean, that is over half a millennium ago. It feels like he is from a different planet, let alone a different time.
The gap is just massive. Culturally, the early 1500s have way more in common with the Middle Ages than they do with our digital age. It's a completely different world.
It is.
But the goal of our discussion today really is to shatter that caricature. We want to find the human being underneath the black hat. We want to uncover the shy, reluctant scholar who really, truly just wanted to be left alone with his books, but who was used by Providence to completely overhaul Western society, church government, and education.
Okay, you just said he restructured Western society.
Yeah.
That is a massive claim. I mean, most of our listeners, they know the theology. They know the acronym TULUPI. They know about predestination. They know the term Calvinism. But you are suggesting his footprint goes way beyond church doctrine.
It absolutely does. And this is where we need to, wake people up to the reality of history. If you look at the serious historians, men like George Bancroft, or the great German historian Leopold von Ranke, they don't just credit Calvin with being a good theologian.
No.
They credit him as being the virtual founder of America.
Okay, stop there. The founder of America. That sounds like we're engaging in some pretty serious historical revisionism. You were telling me a French lawyer living in Switzerland in the 1500s is responsible for the United States.
It sounds wild until you actually connect the dots. Bancroft argued that the fanatic for Calvinism was a fanatic for liberty. I mean, just think about the lineage. You have Geneva. The ideas from Geneva go to Scotland with John Knox. They go to England with the Puritans. Those Puritans then cross the Atlantic to Massachusetts. You have the Huguenots going to South Carolina. The Dutch Calvinists in Manhattan.
So it's an intellectual migration.
It's an intellectual and spiritual migration. The concept of Republican liberty, the whole idea that you need checks and balances because no single man can be trusted with absolute authority, that comes directly from Calvin's reading of the Bible. If you ignore Calvin, you really cannot understand where American liberty came from.
So if we like the idea that the president is not a king, we might have to thank the guy in the black hat.
Precisely.
All right, I am intrigued. Let's unpack this. We need to figure out how a guy who basically wanted to be a librarian ended up shaping the modern world. Let's go back to the very beginning. Set the stage for us. It is the early 16th century. What does the world look like?
Well, it's a mess. Europe isn't the map of clean borders we see today. Not at all. It is more like a quilt of tribes and family alliances and fiefdoms. You've got the Holy Roman Empire, which, as they say, was neither holy nor Roman nor an empire.
Right.
You have France, but the one thing holding it all together, the glue of the West, is the Roman Catholic Church. The Pope is the ultimate authority. But the ground is shaking. The tectonic plates are shifting.
How so?
You have the Renaissance, you have the discovery of the New World, you have the printing press. We're standing right on the edge of the modern world.
And right in the middle of all this chaos, Jean Calvin is born July 10th, 1509.
In Noyon, France. It is a cathedral town in Picardy, about 60 miles northeast of Paris. A very old, very ecclesiastical town.
We hear a lot about his father, Gerard. But do we know anything about his mother?
Very, very little, sadly. Her name was Jeanne La France. By all accounts, she was a beautiful, pious woman, but she died when Calvin was only 5 years old.
5? Wow, that is incredibly young.
It is devastating, and you have to wonder how that shaped him. He doesn't write about it explicitly, of course, but losing your mother at 5? It leaves a mark. It creates a certain solitude, I think.
For sure.
But his father, Gerard, he was the dominant force. Gerard was a notary, an administrative assistant in the cathedral complex. He was a man who knew how the system worked, and he had ambition for his sons.
He had a specific roadmap for John, right?
Oh, he did. There were 5 kids, 3 sons, 2 daughters. Calvin was the middle son. And Gerard looked at this boy who was, bright, sharp, maybe a little intense, and he decided, this one is going to be a priest.
It makes sense. I mean, if you work for the church and you want your kid to have job security, you put him in the church.
It was the path to stability, the best career path available. So in 1521, Gerard pulls some strings and gets the 12-year-old Calvin a benefice, which is basically a church salary to pay for his education. And he sends him off to Paris.
Paris in the 1520s. I mean, paint that picture for us. This isn't the romantic Paris of the 1920s with Hemingway and Fitzgerald.
Not at all, no. It was crowded, it was dirty, and it was the intellectual center of the universe. Calvin ends up at the Collège de Montaigu. And you need to understand what this place was like.
Okay.
It was legendary for how awful it was. Erasmus studied there a generation earlier, and he hated it. He complained about the rotten eggs, the freezing cold dorms, the incredibly harsh discipline.
Sounds miserable.
It was ascetic to the extreme. They were trying to, beat the sin out of you while at the same time filling your head with logic.
But this is where Calvin's mind was sharpened. This is the forge.
It was a forge, exactly. He studied logic, rhetoric, the arts. He was influenced by men like John Major, a Scottish theologian. This is where Calvin learned how to think. He didn't just memorize facts. He learned how to deconstruct an argument, how to analyze a text, how to spot a logical fallacy from a mile away.
And you can see that in his writing.
Oh, absolutely. If you read the Institutes today, you see that legal, logical precision. That was forged in the cold dorms of Montaigu.
So he is on the fast track to the priesthood. He is brilliant. He is rising in the ranks. And then the plan changes. His dad pulls the emergency brake.
Gerard changed his mind. And it wasn't because of some, spiritual awakening. It was about money.
Of course.
Gerard got into a dispute with the cathedral chapter in Noyon. He was actually excommunicated later over financial issues. And he decided that the church wasn't the best place for his son anymore. He looked at the legal profession and saw dollar signs.
Simple as that.
Simple as that. He told Calvin to drop theology and study law.
I just love the humanity of that decision. It is so pragmatic. Son, the priest gig is okay, but lawyers get paid.
Exactly.
But if we look at this through the lens of providence, that decision it's pivotal.
It is the hinge of history. If Calvin stays in theology, maybe he becomes a bishop. Maybe he writes some interesting Catholic reform tracts. But he never becomes Calvin. By sending him to law school first in Orleans, then in Bourges, God was equipping him with the specific toolkit he would need later on.
How so? What did law give him that theology wouldn't have?
Because the Reformation in Geneva wasn't just about preaching sermons. It was about building a new society. It was about writing a constitution. It was about legislation.
Right, the practical stuff.
The practical stuff.
Yeah.
Calvin's legal training taught him how to structure a government, how to write laws, how to think about civil jurisdiction. He was a legislator as much as he was a pastor. He could not have done what he did in Geneva without those years in law school.
It's just so ironic. The Father acts out of greed, and God uses it to build the framework for a reformed republic.
God rarely draws with straight lines.
So he is studying law, but he is also getting sucked into this world of humanism. We need to define that, because today, if I say I am a humanist, people think I'm an atheist.
Right. It means something totally different now. In the 16th century, humanism wasn't about putting man above God. It was a literary movement. The slogan was ad fontes, which means to the sources.
Back to the originals.
Exactly. The humanists were tired of the medieval scholastic clutter. They wanted to go back to the original texts, the original Latin of Cicero, the original Greek of the philosophers, and eventually the original Greek and Hebrew of the Bible.
And Calvin was good at this.
He was a prodigy. He learned Greek. He learned Hebrew. He was just swimming in the deep end of classical scholarship. In fact, his first published book had nothing to do with the Bible.
What was it?
It was a commentary on Seneca's De Clementia.
Published in 1532. And even in this pagan commentary, you see sparks of his future politics.
You do. It's fascinating. He analyzes Seneca's advice to the Emperor Nero, and Calvin argues that there is a moral law that is above the king. He writes that the prince is not above the laws, but the laws above the prince.
That is a dangerous thing to say in France in 1532. I mean, Francis I is the king. He is an absolute monarch. He is the state.
It was a radical idea. France was a monarchy where the king's word was law. And here's this young scholar already toying with the idea that there is a standard that even the king has to bow to. It is the seed of constitutionalism.
So we have this brilliant young lawyer. He is a humanist scholar. He is publishing commentaries on Roman philosophers. He looks set for a nice, comfortable life in the ivory tower. But then the crash.
And everything changes.
This brings us to part 2. Conversion and the reluctant leader.
This is where the mystery comes in. Calvin is incredibly private. I mean, Luther will tell you about his bowel movements and his spiritual angst in graphic detail.
Right.
Calvin, just silence. We have almost no diary entries. The only real account of his conversion comes from the preface to his commentary on the Psalms, which he wrote in 1557. We're talking decades later.
And even that is brief.
It is maddeningly brief. He says he was obstinately addicted to the superstitions of the papacy. He was hard to move. But then, he says, God subdued and brought my mind to a teachable frame.
Teachable frame. I like that phrase.
He calls it a sudden conversion. We don't know the day or the hour, but sometime around 1533 or 1534, the switch flipped. He realized that the church had drifted from the scriptures, and he could not stay. He says he was inflamed with an intense desire to pursue true godliness.
And typically for Calvin, he didn't want to make a big scene. He just wanted to learn.
That's it. He writes, "My one great object was to live in seclusion without being known." He wanted to find a quiet corner, stack up his books, and just read. But he says, God so led me about. He never permitted me to rest in any place.
And he certainly didn't get any rest in Paris. The atmosphere there was turning toxic. Tell us about the Cop affair, because this feels like a scene from a spy movie.
It really is. It is late 1533. Nicholas Cop is a friend of Calvin's, and he is the newly elected rector of the University of Paris. He has to give an inaugural address. Traditionally, this would be a boring speech in Latin praising the faculty. But Cop, and many people think Calvin wrote the speech for him, gets up and delivers a barn burner. He preaches justification by faith. He talks about the need for reform. He quotes Erasmus and Luther.
In the heart of Catholic Paris.
It was explosive. The king, Francis I, was furious. He saw it as sedition. He ordered the arrest of the Lutherans. Cop fled immediately. And then the police came for Calvin.
This is where the legend gets specific, isn't it?
It is. The story goes that while the officers were banging on the front door of his lodgings, Calvin was tying his bedsheets together to climb out the window at the back.
You're kidding?
He escaped through the window, dressed as a vine dresser, a gardener, with a hoe on his shoulder. He slipped out of Paris in disguise.
The great theologian, masquerading as a gardener, running for his life.
It shows you the danger. This wasn't a game. People were being burned. This is the era where the placards incident happens, where Protestants put up posters attacking the Mass, and the king responds by burning heretics at the stake. Calvin saw his friends die.
That has to change a man. It is one thing to debate theology in a classroom. It is another to smell the smoke of your friends burning.
It solidified his hatred of tyranny. He saw the state acting as a beast, devouring its own citizens for their conscience. It wasn't abstract for him anymore. It was personal.
So he is on the run. He is using aliases Charles Despil, Marcianus Lucanius. He is moving from city to city, trying to find a safe haven. He wants to go to Strasbourg. It is a free city. It is German-speaking. It is safe.
But he can't get there. There is a war going on between Francis I and the Emperor Charles V. The direct road is blocked by troop movements. So he has to take a detour. He looks at the map and decides to head south, loop around, and spend one night in Geneva.
One night, that's all. He has no intention of staying. He just needs a bed.
He checks into an inn. He thinks he is anonymous. But Geneva is a small town, and the Reformation is already bubbling there. The leader of the movement in Geneva is a man named William Farel.
Let's talk about Farel for a second. Because if Calvin is ice, Farel is fire.
That's a great way to put it. Farel was a redhead, fiery, loud, explosive. He was a street preacher. He had been leading the charge in Geneva, smashing statues, shouting down priests. But he was a destroyer, not a builder. He knew he needed someone with a mind to organize the chaos.
And someone tells him, hey, the guy who wrote the Institutes is at the inn.
Farel runs to the inn. He barges into the room. He looks at this young, skinny scholar. Calvin is only 27 at this point, and he says, "You are staying. We need you."
And Calvin, being Calvin, says no thanks.
Calvin lists all his excuses. I am shy. I am constitutionally weak. I need quiet to study. I am not a man of action. I can help the movement better by writing books in a quiet room. All valid points from his perspective.
But Farel doesn't accept that.
Not for a second. Farel stands up, and you can just imagine the vein popping in his forehead, and he thunders at him. He says, "May God curse your studies if now, in her time of need, you refuse to lend your aid to his church."
May God curse your studies.
Yeah.
I mean, that is a heavy thing to say to a man who has dedicated his entire life to God.
It terrified Calvin. He later wrote, "I felt as if God had from heaven laid his mighty hand upon me to arrest me." He was physically shaken. He couldn't leave. He felt that if he walked out that door, he was walking away from God's will. So, against every natural instinct, he stayed.
The reluctant leader. He didn't campaign for the job. He was drafted at gunpoint, basically.
Spiritual gunpoint, yes.
But it wasn't a fairy tale ending, was it?
Mm-hmm.
This brings us to part 3. The first stay in Geneva was a disaster.
A total failure. An absolute mess. He stayed from 1536 to 1538. Geneva was a Wild West town. They had just thrown out the Duke of Savoy and the bishop. They wanted political freedom, but they weren't necessarily looking for moral holiness.
Right.
Factions were fighting in the streets. People were gambling, drinking, brawling.
And Calvin and Farel tried to clean it up too fast.
They did. They tried to impose moral discipline on a city that just wasn't ready for it, and it all came to a head over the Lord's Supper. The city was in such a state of rebellion and open sin that Calvin and Farel felt they could not, in good conscience, give communion to the populace. They felt it would be mocking the body of Christ. So, on Easter Sunday, 1538, they refused to administer the sacraments.
They went on a communion strike.
Essentially, yes. They preached, but they withheld the bread and wine. The city council was furious. They saw the preachers as employees of the state, and employees do what they are told.
I see.
So within days, the council voted to banish them. They were kicked out of the city.
And honestly, looking at Calvin's personality, he must have been thrilled.
Oh, he was relieved. He basically said, good riddance. He thought, finally, I can go to Strasbourg and study like I wanted to in the first place. And that is exactly what he did.
He goes to Strasbourg. He spends 3 years there, from 1538 to 1541. And by all accounts, these were the happiest years of his life.
They were his golden years, without a doubt. He was mentored by Martin Bucer, who was a real father figure to him. Bucer taught him how to be a pastor, not just a theologian. Calvin pastored a church of French refugees, about 500 people. He got to preach, he got to teach in Johann Sturm's academy, and he didn't have the weight of running a whole city on his shoulders.
And this is where he fell in love. Or at least this is where he got married.
Well, his friends were trying to set him up. It's actually quite funny. Calvin wrote a letter listing his requirements for a wife. He said, "I am not one of those insane lovers who embrace even the vices of those they are in love with."
Sounds romantic.
It does. He wanted a woman who was chaste, obliging, not fastidious, economical, patient, and careful for my health.
He wanted a nurse and a housekeeper.
It sounds dry, but then he met Idelette De Bure. She was a widow. She had been an Anabaptist, converted to the Reformed faith. She had 2 children. She wasn't wealthy. She wasn't a young beauty queen, but she was exactly what he needed.
They married in 1540, and this is where we see the soft heart of Calvin.
We do. We see a man who deeply, deeply loved his wife. They were only married for 9 years. Idelette had chronic health issues. They had a son together, Jacques, who was born prematurely and died after just 2 weeks.
That's just heartbreaking.
It shattered them. Calvin wrote to a friend, "The Lord has certainly inflicted a severe and bitter wound in the death of our baby son, but he is himself a father and knows best what is good for his children."
And then Idelette herself died in 1549.
And Calvin's grief was raw. This is the part the character completely misses. He wrote to Violette, his friend, "I have been bereaved of the best companion of my life, of one who, had it been so ordered, would not only have been the willing sharer of my exile and poverty, but even of my death." He said he could barely keep going.
Wow.
He raised her children as his own. He never remarried. He carried that love and that loss for the rest of his life.
He wasn't a robot. He was a man who knew what it was to weep next to a grave.
Absolutely. His theology of suffering was not academic. It was forged in the cemetery.
So he is in Strasbourg, he is happy, he is healing, but back in Geneva, things are going off the rails again.
Geneva was collapsing. Without the moral center that Calvin and Farel provided, the city just fell into chaos. The Catholics were trying to win the city back. The council realized they had made a huge mistake. They needed the Frenchmen back.
So they send a delegation to beg him to return. And Calvin's reaction is, it's visceral.
He was horrified. He wrote, "There is no place under heaven I am more afraid of than Geneva." He compared returning to being strapped to a rack torture device. He said he would rather die 1,000 deaths than go back to that cross.
But he went. Why?
Duty. He believed that his life was not his own. He wrote to the council, "I offer my heart promptly and sincerely." That became his motto. He believed God was calling him back, and he could not say no to God, even if it meant misery for himself.
So he arrives back into Geneva in 1541. This is part 4, the return. And this moment in the pulpit is one of the greatest moments in church history.
It is so cinematic. I mean, picture the scene. The Cathedral of St. Pierre is packed. The people are nervous. They expect him to tear them apart. They expect a sermon on why you were wrong to kick me out. They expect anger.
He is the perfect opportunity for an I told you so moment.
It's a perfect opportunity. He walks up the steps to the high pulpit. The silence is deafening. He opens the Bible, and he begins to preach on the very next verse following the one he had ended with 3 years ago.
That is unbelievable. He just picked up exactly where he left off.
As if nothing had happened. As if the 3-year exile was just a pause for a breath. It was a masterstroke. He was saying, I am not here to talk about myself. I am not here to talk about politics. I am here to preach the word of God. The word continues. It established his authority instantly.
So he is back. And this time, he is going to build the godly society. But we need to clear up a misconception. People call Geneva a theocracy. They think Calvin was the Ayatollah of Geneva.
That is just historically lazy. It wasn't a theocracy in the sense that the church ran the state. In fact, Calvin spent his entire career fighting to keep the state out of the church.
Explain that. That seems counterintuitive.
He drafted the Ecclesiastical Ordinances in 1541. The core battle of his whole ministry was over the consistory, the church court. Calvin insisted that the church, and only the church, had the right to excommunicate sinners.
And the city council didn't like that.
The city council wanted that power. They wanted to decide who took communion. Calvin said, no, that is a spiritual matter. The state holds the sword, the church holds the keys.
So it was actually a separation of powers.
It was. He was trying to create distinct spheres of jurisdiction. Now, did they overlap? Of course. Did the state enforce moral laws? Yes. But Calvin never held civil office. He couldn't even vote for most of his time there. He was a resident alien. His power was purely moral. He ruled by the pulpit, not by the sword.
But he did care about civil laws.
Yeah.
And not just the big ones. He cared about guardrails.
This is where you see his incredible attention to detail. He helped draft the civil code. He insisted on laws requiring guardrails on balconies so children wouldn't fall off. He pushed for sanitation laws to clean up the sewage in the streets. He helped organize the hospitals.
Why does a theologian care about sewage?
Because the body matters. Because loving your neighbor means making sure they don't get cholera. Because the world is God's theater and it should be clean and orderly. It was a holistic worldview.
Let's talk about the workload, because when you read his schedule, it just makes me want to take a nap.
It is exhausting just to think about. He preached twice every Sunday, and then on alternating weeks, he preached every single day at noon.
Every day.
Every day. That is roughly 20 sermons a month.
And he was writing at the same time.
He wrote commentaries on almost every book of the Bible. He wrote thousands of letters. He wrote theological treatises. He sat in the consistory meetings every Thursday, which were long and contentious.
How did he physically survive?
He barely did. He suffered from migraines, kidney stones, hemorrhoids, gout, tuberculosis. He was constantly in pain, but he just kept working. He had a team of secretaries eventually. In 1549, they hired a man named Denis Raganier to take shorthand notes of his sermons.
Ah, so that's why we have them.
That is why we have them. He would walk into the pulpit with no notes, just the Hebrew or Greek text, and preach for an hour, translating and expositing on the fly.
And people flocked to hear him.
Geneva became a destination. Refugees poured in. And even the people who hated him came to listen. The records show that his enemies, the libertines, would sit in the back. They hated his morality, but they couldn't deny the power of the message. It was the mass media of the 16th century.
This brings us to part 5, the academy and the press. Calvin knew he wasn't going to live forever. He needed a way to export the revolution.
He needed a cloning machine. He needed to create more pastors, more thinkers. So in 1558, he founded the Genevan Academy.
This was the Harvard of the Reformation.
It really was. He modeled it on Sturm's school back in Strasbourg. It started small, but it just exploded. By the time he died, there were 1,200 students in the college and 300 in the seminary.
And these weren't just local kids from Geneva?
No, they were international. They came from France, England, Scotland, Italy, Poland. John Knox came there and called it the most perfect school of Christ that ever was in the earth since the days of the apostles.
That's high praise, and the curriculum was tough.
Brutal. Latin, Greek, Hebrew. Philosophy. Calvin didn't want ignorant preachers. He wanted men who could read the text in the original languages, who could debate the Jesuits, who could think clearly. He believed that piety and intellect had to go hand in hand.
And then he sent them back.
That is the key. It was a missionary hub. They trained for a few years, and then they were sent back into the danger zones. Over 100 missionaries were sent into France alone. They knew they were likely going to their deaths.
And they took books with them. Geneva became a printing factory.
The printing press was the weapon of choice. Robert Estienne, the great printer, moved his whole operation to Geneva. They churned out Bibles, commentaries, tracts. In 1561 alone, they published 48 books.
How did they get them into France? I mean, Protestant Bibles were illegal there.
They were smugglers. They hid books in the false bottoms of wine barrels. They packed them in crates of other goods. Peddlers would carry them in backpacks across the Alps. It was a massive underground network.
You could burn the books, but you couldn't stop the ideas.
The ideas were contagious. And because they were printed in French, not just Latin, the common people could read them. It democratized theology.
Let's shift gears a bit to part 6. Friendships. We have talked about the work, but was he just a lonely workaholic?
That is the myth. But the reality is that Calvin was a man of deep, abiding friendship. He had a circle Theodore Beza, William Farel, Peter Verret. They called the trio of Calvin, Farel, and Verret the tripod.
I love that, the tripod.
They were inseparable in spirit. They wrote constantly. When they were together, they laughed. There are accounts of Calvin playing quoits, a game sort of like horseshoes with his friends. He enjoyed dinner parties. He was not a sourpuss.
There is a story about when Beza got sick, right?
Yes, Beza contracted the plague, I believe, or at least a very severe fever. Calvin was beside himself. He wrote that if Beza died, he wouldn't know how to function. He wept for his friends. He was a man of high emotion. He just channeled it into his work most of the time.
And he wrote thousands of letters.
To everyone. He wrote to the kings of Europe, lecturing them on theology. But he also wrote to women who were being persecuted. He wrote to widows. He took time for the little people. He was a pastor at heart.
Okay, part 7. We need to circle back to that Founder of America claim. We talked about his legal background. How does his theology translate to the U.S. Constitution?
It starts with the doctrine of total depravity.
Which sounds like a real downer.
It sounds bleak, but it is politically practical. Calvin believed that every human being, and every part of their being, is tainted by sin. No one is righteous. No, not one. That includes kings, popes, and presidents.
So if everyone is sinful, you can't trust anyone with too much power.
Bingo. If men were angels, we wouldn't need government. If angels governed men, we wouldn't need controls on government. But because men are wolves, you cannot give one wolf all the power. You have to split it up. You need checks and balances.
So he advocated for a mixed government.
He liked the idea of an aristocracy, not an aristocracy of blood, but of merit combined with democracy. He wanted collegial government. In Geneva, you had the Little Council, the Council of 200, the consistory. Power was distributed.
And that idea traveled to America.
It traveled via the Puritans. They set up town halls in New England. They believed that magistrates should be elected and that they should be held accountable. And then you have the right of resistance.
This is crucial.
This is maybe the most crucial part. Calvin taught that while private citizens shouldn't just start a revolution, the lesser magistrates, the lower officials, have a duty to protect the people from a tyrant. If the king breaks God's law, the lower magistrates can stand up and say no.
That is the script for the American Revolution. The Continental Congress, which were the lesser magistrates, saying no to King George.
It is the exact theological justification used by many of the founders. They weren't anarchists. They were following the Calvinist doctrine of resistance to tyranny.
But for Calvin himself, the goal wasn't political power. It was humility.
He kept coming back to Augustine on this. Humility, humility, and humility. He believed that the only way to know God was to realize how small you are. He was terrified of pride. He saw pride as the root of all heresy.
And that brings us to the end, part 8, the end of the Reformer. It is 1564. Calvin is only 54 years old, but he looks 80.
He is a wreck. He's spitting blood. He can barely walk. He has to be carried to the pulpit in a chair for his final sermons. He knows the end is near.
And he calls people to his bedside.
He summons the magistrates, the politicians, and he gives them one last lecture. He warns them against ambition. He tells them, I am a miserable creature. I have had many faults, but I have tried to be faithful.
He apologizes to them.
He asks forgiveness for his flashes of anger. He knew he had a temper. He didn't claim to be perfect. He just claimed to be a servant of the word.
And then he talks to the ministers.
He gathers the pastors of Geneva. He recounts the early days, the mobs, the rifles fired at his door. He tells them to stick together. He points to Beza and says, "Follow him." He hands over the baton.
He died on May 27, 1564. And the details of his burial are just fascinating.
He left very specific instructions. He wanted to be buried in the common cemetery, Plein Palais, and he insisted no tombstone.
No marker at all. No,
Yeah.
Here lies the great reformer.
Nothing. He wanted to be anonymous in death. He knew the human heart is an idol factory. He didn't want Geneva to become a shrine to Calvin. He didn't want pilgrims coming to worship his bones or his memory. He wanted the focus to be soli Deo Gloria, to God alone be the glory. He wanted to disappear so that Christ would be visible.
It is a profound statement. In an era where everyone wanted a monument, he wanted a patch of grass.
And to this day, we don't know exactly where he is buried. There is a small stone there now that marks a possible spot, but nobody knows for sure, and that is exactly how he wanted it.
So we have travels from the filth of Paris to the pulpit of Geneva. We've seen the reluctant leader, the grieving husband, the friend, the architect of liberty.
We have seen a man who was far more complex, far more human than the caricature. He wasn't a joyless tyrant. He was a man consumed by the glory of God.
It is February 14th, 2026. We are looking back 500 years. As we wrap this all up, what is the takeaway? Why does this matter to the guy driving his car right now?
I think the challenge for us is this. We live in the age of the self. We are obsessed with our brand, our platform, our legacy. We want to be known. Calvin offers a countercultural critique. He suggests that the most effective life is the one that is given away. He suggests that you can change the world not by seeking power, but by seeking truth.
And maybe the most powerful way to leave a legacy is to not care if anyone remembers your name.
Precisely. The man with the unmarked grave shaped the world more than the kings with the pyramids.
That is something to think about. Thank you for diving deep with us. This has been Reformed Thinking. We will see you next time.